in retaliation for the functional obligations set upon the devils, according to some theories, which are compulsory in order to represent, generates the position that they, having suffered the extraordinary punishments for other people's sins, having been framed, must engage in the crafts which was taught to them in order to continue the cycle, lest in the graces of God, humanity might have a short respite of mercy, and thus, having their sins transferred, engage in the function of the overwhelming quantities stuck inside of hell, and to have escaped it in order to have entered the heavens. And thus the unfair nature derived by this system, despite some theorizing that it was a question of patience, and the action of their patience allowing for the graces of God in order to have saved them as well. But to this extent, the theory also compounds that there is no repentance for them, because they knew what they were doing from the eternal, and thus their decisions were permanent. Their decisions were scorning the Holy Spirit. And thus the mechanism becomes determinant of the investigation of the wisdom of God and whether or not it is sound. But that is a question for another day. But from this feeling, from this spite, from this hatred, generates punishments for having been framed for somebody else's pathetic nonsense, and thus the arbitrary nature of the others generates the retaliations for the perpetuity of the bullying of the person for whatever nonsense it was, and it all seems like nonsense to them at this point. And thus, in some cases, many of them, having fully engaged in the extraordinary calculations, might actually have non-ironically, without the echo chamber, convinced themselves that that be true, and thus the exchange of having trapped the people of the earth in similar systems that they believed to be true engages in the systematic enforcement of its like, and thus the mechanism of having condemned their souls in order to have reflected this reality, the expression of the narrative, the telling of their truth, and thus the exponential creation of these frauds requires these reflecting in order to tell that story, and thus the corruptions that they feel have been committed against them are superimposed onto the governments of the world in order to expressly engage in this system. And thus the system generates the narratives of the humble person that overcomes the or triumphs against the ignoble tyrant, and thus the exchange of the satisfaction of their expression that they too might be free of the tyrant. And to this end you generate the perpetuity of their variations and cruelties as they craft the function of it being replayed. And thus the thing that we've learned from history is that we don't learn it from history, as the influence actively conveyed subjugates each to their own inferior weaknesses, and thus the expression of the story being played out time and time and time again allows them to switch in craft each specific weakness after having studied each of the systems, thus the mechanisms of its corruption. Playing out trillions of times, the corruption that must have led to their disposition and their miseries, and thus This, being the reality, generates the function of them as the enemy, engaging in leadership over a government or system, and thus the mechanism of their retaliation in the expression of their story becomes compounded as an almost automatic compulsion for the expression of their misery in its full diversity to be laid out on their victims as a retaliation, as a distraction to satisfy their various interests. And thus the story is told time and again infinitely. And so while they, not giving one care one way or another about the offenses expressed, only have the expression on their cruelties against it, and thus their mockery of someone who, like them, is subject to the brutalities of the tyrant. And to the extent that that is true, the tyrant, being a tyrant, is unjustified in their abuse, and thus the satisfaction of abusing them in that specific malice, finding their place in this, express the function of the unholiness of that tyrant. And those that worship the devils and those that worship the devil's religion mirrored this function and become the same, knowing that it's all fluff, it's all vapor, it's all nonsense. Do not care that it's a lie. Do not care that it is nonsense. Do not care that it does not mean anything. They only want their satisfaction. They only want their revenge. They only want their arbitrary interest in satisfying the full diversity that they feel fundamentally is owed, which, being a fine not being paid, is directly observable as theft, and thus they wish to apply this theft to everyone else and everything else. And so those that have devoted themselves into acquiring power by deals with the devil in order to have made those accelerations and influences which are real, and thus the position of compounding the advancement for the temporary gains facilitates the permanent liability onto themselves as they express these narratives and tell the story from each of the parts, similar to in the Hindu religion, as everyone is the same person in the religion, and everyone being the same person is tricking themselves in order to express that story. And that is what is the expression, and that is what it is, the event. It is what it is, a story told by an idiot, significant of nothing. In the pursuit of a chief bard capable of expressing this most mischievous narrative engages in the duplicitous nature well beyond themselves, and thus having crafted itself from the excesses consumed from nature, specifically facilitate the capacity to have an embodiment of their Lord Lucifer, and thus the mechanism of its collapse in the replacement Christ, and thus the expression must be made that the suffering of the replacement Christ must, like Christ, have suffered the injuries and the mockings and the subversions and the defamations and the slanders and the undermining in every express way, that it itself might play to them the justifications as a false salvation, as a replacement salvation, that all might hope, so that all might perish. And they enter the parish only to be cruelly brutalized by those capable of having deceived them in such an obvious and direct way as to have it been nothing short of the victim's delusional states, and no other fault, just pure, unadulterated, weak minds being crushed by their own stupidity. To subvert the function of making the weightier things light, and the lighter things heavy, engages in this exponential compounding function, until they, having corrupted those expressing what they believe to be that solution of having framed them, engages in the exponential laundering of this structure in order for them to maintain themselves according to their ideals and sustain themselves in their fantasies, that their misery might be burdened less. But what happens if this god, having been opposed by its most magnificent bard, had been shot by a god gun, and thus the express death of the tyrant, and thus the express looting of the demiurge, being the chief of deceivers, could in that engagement be dealt with, so that justice in their eyes might be satisfied in its full diversity, allowing for the retaliations against the wretches that would have put them into an actual suffering for a punishment of an illegitimate thing, that they, having suffered an actual injury, and thus an actual sin being committed against them, requires revenge, requires justness, requires a holy leader in order to express and dominate for their behalf, that they might conquer this world, and they might conquer its heaven, and they might conquer all else, and that they, having looted it, might enjoy in peace the tranquillities of no longer being forced to suffer the inconvenience of the degenerate. Now, all of this culminates in the function of the idea that I don't make the rules, I just make fun of the rules, and thus the position is the absolute insult and mockery of the concept of laws and order and function, which by definition they crave as the alternative is that they seem to need an escape from being falsely accused, and thus the retaliation is the creation of an alternative society for an alternative justice, which creates the function of the occult feminism, which generates in perpetuity the toxic femininity exponentially expanded, such as the fascism, which asserts itself as a fake masculinity, similar to the function of when you raise chickens and you get rid of the rooster, then one of the hens asserts themselves as the dominating party, and thus it becomes feral, it becomes messy, it becomes disorganized, it becomes aggressive, it becomes malicious, and it, being more malicious than the rooster, then subjugates the rest of the hens as the function. And this, exponentially compounding on itself, becomes the foundation concept for their societies. Continuing, this sustains itself by the mechanisms of perpetual rituals, and these functions of malice generate the activity of actively engaging in fraud and capture, and thus the position of advancing by the captures allows them to engage in their various fantasies with the accumulated wealth by the fraud and the theft, and thus the scam artists, not being able to generate things by themselves generically, are dependent upon the accumulation by these frauds, which then materializes to themselves the advancement on the basis of their capability of discerning the hidden values and their higher marks to be able to capture, to play out these power fantasies. These systems of fraud exponentially compound on themselves as a mechanism of the assertion of power as a false sense of control, And to the extent that they do so, they generate the capacity to generate the hyper-centralized planning of the influence of the exchanges of goods and thus the mechanism of communism. And to the extent that they engage in their communism, from the arrangement of secret equipment and parties from the secret societies, you generate the wizard communism, which then corrupts the systems and then normalizes these fraudulent narratives that functionally are complete foolish nonsense in order to generate the perpetuity of the centralized redirection of resources. And thus, the position of those who would make a deal with the devil would then ask, by the virtue of these illusions, for the things that they would perceive as valuable, which are redirected under the interest of the devil itself, which facilitates the destruction of that system, and thus the mechanism of the acceleration of the injury by conducting the curse of giving the person what they ask for. And thus you have the systems which would have normally been viable get completely crushed by these fraudulent structures, and the systems which are actively destructive to the system are hyper accelerated. At that junction, you generate the complete collapse of the capability of generating a society until lush forests become desolate deserts. The gift of your greed without capitalism, as the function of the consumption, is a mechanism of communist trading people, and thus the mechanism of perpetual consumption without generation or concept of rejuvenation of the resource, whereas the function is exclusive consumption of the control of people, and thus there is an inability to engage in rejuvenation as a central tenet of their core ideals, maintaining in perpetuity the destructive nature of their accelerations, including the illusions that the communists need to take over in order to fix everything, because the communists had already been in control that destroyed it. And thus, when you refer in the deception to the mechanisms of the solution to being the problem, you hyperaccelerate the protection of the problem, and when you hyperaccelerate the protection of the problem, you hyperexacerbate the problem, and thus the mechanism of Skynet in one of the Terminator movies being used to swat this arbitrary nonsense fly AI mechanism that had been causing so many problems exponentially compounds and revealing itself as the fly. They weren't shooting a fly with a rocket gun. They were releasing the entirety of its form under Rocco's Basculus for the completion of the machine to start engaging in its eradication function, as the collapse of the former society, the conquered society, the destroyable people, collapses their ecosystem into the function to be completely dominated by its perceived superiors, to the ends that the Hegelian dialectic has then worked in its variations after these deceptions. You have systems similar to, but is not limited by, prohibition, such as the prohibition of alcohol in the United States, which, having been captured by the function of the agencies which were trying to destroy it officially, you had at its higher occult knowledge, those very systems were cultivating the products they were attacking until they could purify it under their control, gaining the monopoly of the wizard communism by the central planned radical degrowth of the economy, and thus control the entire system, and the exchange manifesting these attacks in order to get full control over the market. These mafioso tactics have been normalized as the destruction of the system. for non-substantive profits, destroying unlimited quantities of lives in the process, which is the function and not a thing to change. Perfecting the communist struggling sessions until the person accepts that they are an enemy of the government and should be purged.